Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tim Minchell. I'm the Dr. John C. Taylor Professor of Innovation and Head of the Institute for Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge. So we're absolutely delighted that you're all here today, and thank you for everybody online who's joined us today as well. I will just do one thing, which is to talk you through the agenda, and then I'll hand over to Lord Sainsbury, who will say a few words, and then on to the lead author of this year's Innovation Report, Dr. Carlos Lopez-Gomez. And then we'll have a panel discussion to talk things through. But that, in a little more detail, is on this slide here. So Lord Sainsbury has kindly agreed to set the scene for this report, building on the last 2 years, and also reflecting on his own experience as a minister, how useful this data is and would have been and will be in the future. Carlos will then give an overview of the key points from the report. The report, by the way, is now available for download. Is that correct, Carlos? Yes, from now, from the CIIP website. More on that in a moment. And then we shift to this panel discussion. We're delighted that we have such a great panel to talk about some of the issues arising from the report. We have Amy Stone from ADS, Miles Gray from DBT, if I get my acronyms right here, Nina from Make UK, and Caroline from the Food and Drink Federation. And the idea there is that they, along with Carlos, can respond to some of the key things coming out from this year's report. But there will also be a chance, when we've posed a few particularly focused questions, to have questions from the audience here. And for those online, please feel free to submit your questions as well. And we have Elizabeth, who will be channeling your questions to me to be asked at the appropriate moment.
So thank you for that introduction. I think today in the UK, we face an extremely difficult economic situation. Along with the other G7 countries, we've been experiencing since 1990, roughly, a slowing rate of economic growth. At the same time, and this is the remarkable thing about it, the economic profession is not able to agree on an explanation why, as a country, our economic performance is so poor. Low demand is the most popular explanation. But some think that poor human capital is the explanation. And some even think that the problem is one of productivity mismeasurement. When you think that actually all G7 countries are experiencing this, it will obviously be obvious to you that the explanations which refer to the tax system or demand in one economy are clearly not the explanation of why all G7 countries are failing in this way. It's also, I think, of interest that no economist I know of is saying that the slow rate of growth has anything to do with competition from abroad. Now, this inability to explain why we have a slow rate of growth is clearly a major problem for policy making, because obviously it's difficult to know how to fix a problem if one doesn't know what the cause of that problem is. So the reason we have a slow rate of growth is quite simply, we have a slow rate of innovation, and we're no longer producing enough high value-added, innovative, world-beating products and services which we can sell for premium prices in world markets. And that is a very simple reason for this. And it really has to be the starting point for asking what we need to do to get a higher rate of growth. So in these circumstances, what do you need to do to achieve a 2% rate of economic growth, which would be considered extremely good in today's circumstances and would be closer to what historically we've achieved in the past? Now, the answer, of course, lies in the hands of industry. Only they can produce the innovative, world-beating products we need to compete in world markets. But the government working with industry can play a productive role, targeting support in areas such as R&D, skills, finance, and demand on medium and high-tech manufacturing companies, green industries, and other advanced industries who have realistic plans to increase that value added per capita. But if government is going to do that effectively, it needs to know a lot more about our overall record in innovation. What is happening in the different sectors of the economy, how our overall level of science funding compares with other countries, and how well it's targeted to help different sectors of the economy increase their rate of innovation and become more competitive. And that's why I think this report is so important. It contains an enormous amount of important information about the UK's innovation reports, which is essential for the government to know about if it is to develop the policies necessary to speed up the innovation rate of UK industry.
Thank you so much, Tim. Good afternoon. My name is Carlos Lopez Gomez, and I am part of the Cambridge Industrial Innovation Policy Group, which is based at the Institute for Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge. It is a timely moment to be presenting the report today. We are now getting more data, a better picture of what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects that it had on global innovation activity. Just last week, the OECD launched its Science, Technology, and Innovation Outlook, and they make the point that this is the first recession, global recession, that did not translate into a reduction on national expenditures in research and innovation. There are three things that we want to do different. We know that there are many studies out there and lots of sources of data, but what we want to do different is to make sure that this is accessible. Sometimes this data is only accessible to specialized audiences and difficult to navigate. So we want to do these three things to make sure it's as useful as possible. We want to keep it accessible, number one. So there are, the report tries to bring all these multiple sources of data and actually curate some of the key indicators, paint a rich picture of what's going on in the UK innovation and industrial performance while keeping it accessible. The second is sectoral analysis. Looking at specific sectors is opening the black box of the economy. If we want to understand why economic performance is like that, we need to look at which sectors are doing well, which ones are struggling, and why. And a focus on sectors, of course, allows us to have this discussion that we're not just want to understand how much investment in research, for example, or how many papers, how many patents, but actually how is that related to the performance of our industries. And finally, international comparisons. We are, indeed, the report has been informed by best practice around the world, other reports that are available to governments in other countries, but also the international perspective looking at comparing UK expenditures on research, for example, but also how different industries are doing in market shares, for example. Like every year, we structure a report across these key policy questions. The kind of questions that we're addressing is, how is the structure and performance of the UK economy changing? Are we, the government and the private sector, investing enough on innovation? How does innovation support internationally competitive industries and well-paid jobs? Is the UK producing enough scientists and engineers? And how does the UK compare in environmental and energy innovation? I'll just start to by giving you the takeaways of the report. So there's 4 takeaways. The first one is the analysis of sector trends tell us that the expansion of labor-intensive services at the expense of higher productivity sectors such as manufacturing has slowed overall productivity growth and widened regional disparities. I'm going to go in more detail on each of these as I go along. Second, a new methodology recently introduced by the Office for National Statistics has pushed up the estimated R&D expenditure of the UK as a share of GDP, just above the 2.4% target that was set up some time ago. However, the UK remains well behind countries like Germany, the United States, and South Korea. 3, the UK aerospace manufacturing is big. It is the 3rd largest in the OECD countries, behind only the United States and France. And 4, the UK food and beverages sector places significant emphasis on product innovation, and there are signs of a growing shift towards automation. But there is an uncertain business environment for the industry that might be hindering investment in innovation, particularly among small and medium-sized enterprise.
I think looking into labor shortages and labor vacancies that manufacturing sector is facing, that's the most important issue that manufacturing sector is at the moment facing. It's about 76,000 vacancies at the moment that are unfilled by the manufacturing businesses. And as Carlos mentioned as well, I think that number slightly lowered, but it's still almost 40% of vacancies aren't unfilled compared to across all the different sectors, only 24%. So that number is staggering, and we definitely need to look immediately into how to solve that.
I have to say a lot of the themes that emerge from the report does resonate with what we're hearing from members, so that's very reassuring. I think what I would say is one of the most striking things was looking at the productivity performance of UK food and drink manufacturing. I think if you look at the sector, maybe our performance over the last few years, we haven't seen the growth that perhaps we would have liked to have seen it, potentially stagnating to a certain extent. But I think there is a real potential to grow that further. But actually, in comparison to some of the other countries, we are actually doing pretty well. So that was quite a surprising thing to see that international comparison. So I feel a bit heartened by that. So, yeah.
That's very nice to hear, because as Carlos frequently reminds me, this isn't about looking for problem areas. It's actually also spotting the things that are going really well and to work out why they're going well and what more could be done to support them.
So first, big thanks to Carlos and his team for doing the report. Really appreciated it. I was absolutely terrified when I heard they were doing it just after COVID, which massively impacted on aerospace.
Yeah.
But the thing that really surprised me, delightfully so, was that the R&D business spend was increasing. Mm-hmm. And I think back to what's the one big thing that's happened to maybe cause that. It's really hard to isolate a cause. But I think about the Aerospace Technology Institute program, where government has committed to a long-term injection of R&D into the sector in a way that matches the product cycles and the product development cycles of the sector. Seems to have had an impact, or at least that's the story I'm going to stick to.
So the thing that struck me in a positive way was about the manufacturing spread, sort of the regional productivity piece. I think across the four sectors that ADS represents, but also in aerospace, we are really regionally spread. So it's good weight for us to have this report that shows how valuable that is back into the productivity conversation. So I'll definitely be using that and pushing that round for the future. So really welcomed that.
I would just like to emphasize this point about the differences between London and the rest. When we look at global GDP, usually across the world, manufacturing represents around 16% of global GDP. The UK has around 9%, 9-10%. Mm-hmm. We think, well, we have a low manufacturing, but actually manufacturing is quite high in some of the regions, in Wales, Northern Ireland. The thing is, there's only 2% of manufacturing in London. So actually other regions are with the global average. Manufacturing keeps being quite important in those regions. The thing is, the London economy is very different. As I had mentioned, those service jobs are actually concentrated here.
And Carlos, I know you mentioned the vacancy rate. So yeah, we're sort of running vacancies at 7%, which is double the manufacturing average. And food and drink manufacturers are looking at a number of areas, looking at sort of how do we attract more labour and skills into the industry, so better pay, benefits, even looking at the way in terms of our shift patterns within the factories, can we do some more flexible options there, shorter shift patterns. So we're trying to be really creative in terms of attracting more talent into the industry, but also as part of the solution, we are looking at automation as part of that. And we were, I think pre-pandemic, we were the second largest purchaser of robots after automotive. But what I would say is that investment is not universal across the industry, and we are, 97% of the sector are SMEs. So they are really, it's difficult to make those sort of longer term investments. Obviously limited resources, huge cost pressures that we're under at the moment. But also it's just the way that we operate. Many food and drink manufacturers operate on short term retail contracts. So it can be gosh, three to 6 months, and you don't know whether you'll get that contract again. So to kind of make that investment in the longer term, I think, you know, if I compare ourselves to aerospace, where you're working on a 20-year contract, you know, it's very different. You know, highly competitive industry, retail environment, which makes it quite difficult to make those investments. So how do we support the industry to do that, to de-risk some of those investments? And we're really keen to work with government in that area to make it, you know, get that targeted support for food and drink SMEs, because we do see a real potential. As I say, you know, second largest robot purchaser. I think there's more we can be doing.
My experience of the large overseas owned companies, multinationals, is that they actually behave quite rationally. When they're looking at investment decisions about what's the technology I need to invest in, what's the product I'm going to put it into, and they're making decisions about where they locate that work, they look at a number of factors. They look at what's the quality of the universities, what's the workforce, what's the government support, what's the broader business environment, and they do a pretty objective study. I'm sure there is some politics that sneak into there, but ultimately our aim is to make the UK the lowest risk option, so that they can complete the R&D in the timescale that they need. And then once they've done that, they can have access to the manufacturing know-how to commercialize it cost effectively. And that's the game that we're trying to play by making the UK a good option. That includes a whole range of things, but hugely importantly is the amount of R&D support that we can provide with them. We risk share their R&D up to TRL 7. So technology readiness 6 or 7, usually 6. And that's on par with all of the other 4 major aerospace nations that were in your chart. So the US, France, and Germany have all had those programs in place for many years. Ours started in 2013, and I'm hoping it's making the difference. What's the big issue? How many planes have been launched in the period of your study? Well, I can't think of any. So the real tell will be when a new aircraft is actually launched, and you look at the amount of manufacturing that the UK has as part of that plane. And hopefully, because we've invested in that technology over the long term, we will see an increase in our share of the components on a plane.
You raised some really good points there. It is about the long cycles that are looked at, and I think that's why the decarbonisation point is really important for us as a sector right now, because decisions are being made, have been made, were made yesterday or made tomorrow about that next requirements for the new aircraft and what technologies will be. So it's really important for the UK to have some level of involvement and engagement in that. And I think that's why the R&D piece matters so much, like I say, especially on the new technologies that are coming through.
Just one little thing to pick out, I think, that's really interesting now that there's a series of these reports which picks up on an issue raised by every member of the panel and hinted at in the questions, which is these are longer term issues. These are not things that just happen in response to, say, Brexit or COVID or whatever. Those are happening and those are important, but there's the longer term issues such as dealing with net zero that absolutely require us to have a better understanding of the links between the skills, the technology, and the supply chain. If I can just say a couple of final words just to wrap things up. So thank you for coming along today. Thank you for joining us online. Thank you for everybody who contributed to the report, the research team, as well as all those who provided content for it. A big thank you to all our panelists here. And if you want to get involved, there are many ways you can do that. And any of the team from CIIP will be happy to talk about that. The discussion carries on. So as was exemplified by some of the comments made, this is about us getting input to support better data gathering, better data presentation to help make better decisions for policy. And finally, the report is available now, and we'd encourage you not only to have a good look at it, but also to share it, as well as sending back comments. And on that note, I shall just say thank you to everybody for your time and attention. It's been a great afternoon. Thank you.